It was late September when my friends and I decided to take a weekend trip to a cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I say we loosely because in reality, it was more like my friend Josh's idea, and none of us could come up with a good reason to say no. There was Emily, his girlfriend, my brother, Marcus, and me. We wanted to get away from the city, the constant buzzing, the stress of our jobs and classes, and spend a few days in the quiet wilderness. The promise of isolation, crisp mountain air, and campfires sounded perfect. None of us had ever stayed in a remote cabin before, and that added an unspoken thrill to the trip. The drive up was long, taking us past dense forests, winding roads, and eventually to dirt tracks that seemed more suitable for ATVs than SUVs. Josh, behind the wheel of his old Subaru, kept insisting we were close, even though the GPS clearly indicated otherwise. "Trust me," he said, grinning as he swerved past a fallen branch. "We're almost there." The road ended in a narrow clearing where the cabin stood, smaller than I had imagined, with a steeply pitched roof and windows that reflected the dying light of the sun. It looked abandoned at first glance. No power lines, no smoke from a chimney. But as we approached, the sight, a stack of chopped firewood and a swing hanging from a massive oak tree, told us otherwise. The cabin smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic, a scent that made me wrinkle my nose. We unpacked quickly, eager to start a fire and explore the surrounding forest. Marcus and I took the first shift stacking wood and striking the flint, while Josh and Emily went to investigate the small path that led to a nearby creek. The creek wasn't more than a few hundred yards away, but the sound of flowing water was soothing, like nature's version of white noise. That night, after cooking a simple dinner over the fire, sausages, bread, and marshmallows, we sat outside, sharing beers and talking about nothing important. The sky was impossibly dark, the stars sharp against the black canvas of the mountains. I felt a thrill in the isolation, like we were the only people left on Earth. Around 11, Josh suggested we play a prank on Marcus by hiding in the woods and jumping out at him. We laughed, agreeing it would be harmless fun, but as we disappeared into the shadows, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The forest was dense, and every sound seemed amplified. The snapping of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. Emily, who had wandered a few steps ahead of me, suddenly screamed. I sprinted toward her, heart hammering, but it was just a raccoon that had lunged at her from a low bush. We laughed nervously, brushing it off, but my stomach didn't settle. When we returned to the cabin, Marcus was sitting by the fire, staring at the darkness beyond the clearing. "Guys," he said, voice low, "I think I saw someone out there, watching us." We chalked it up to nerves or shadows playing tricks on our eyes. But as the night went on, strange things began happening. The wind picked up, howling through the trees in a way that sounded almost like whispering. Every time one of us stepped outside to use the outhouse, a small, rickety structure a short walk from the cabin, we felt eyes on us, though when we turned, there was nothing. Objects seemed to move slightly when we weren't looking. A log that had been near the fire was now lying 10 feet away. A cup of beer we had set on the porch railing had tipped over without explanation. On the second night, things escalated. We were all gathered inside, sitting on the wooden floor around a small lantern, when Emily suddenly went pale. "I saw him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "A man, standing by the tree line, just staring at us." Marcus laughed nervously, probably just some hunter or hiker. But deep down, I could tell he didn't believe it either. I tried to dismiss it, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. Around midnight, Josh decided we should all go to bed. The cabin had 2 small bedrooms, and I ended up sharing with Marcus. As I lay there, I could hear the wind outside, but the branches scraping against the walls and the occasional thud of something hitting the roof. Sleep didn't come easy. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch. I froze, straining to listen. Then there was a knock, light, deliberate on the front door. I held my breath. "Probably Josh messing with us," I whispered to Marcus, but he didn't answer. I slowly crept to the window, peering into the darkness, and saw nothing. The knock didn't come again. The next day, we tried to ignore what had happened, chalking it up to nerves and the eerie isolation. We went for a hike, following a trail that wound through thick forest and steep hills. Around mid-afternoon, we stumbled across something that made us stop cold. a small clearing with dozens of crude wooden effigies nailed to trees. They were roughly carved, humanoid shapes with faces crudely etched into them. Some were missing limbs, others were partially burned. My stomach turned. Who the hell would do this? I muttered, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Josh tried to rationalize it, probably some local artist or kids messing around. But the unease in his voice betrayed him. We returned to the cabin, and the atmosphere had shifted. The forest didn't feel like a place of quiet retreat anymore. It felt alive, malevolent. That night, as we gathered around the fire, we heard a scream. It wasn't far, maybe a few hundred yards into the woods. It was high-pitched, unnatural, and full of terror. Emily covered her ears, shaking. "We shouldn't be here," she said, tears in her eyes. We tried to leave the next morning, but the Subaru wouldn't start. Josh kept fiddling with it, cursing under his breath. As the hours passed, tension rose. Strange things began happening inside the cabin itself. Doors that had been locked swung open. Windows were found ajar. Objects we had left on tables and counters were moved. And always there was the feeling of eyes, watching, waiting. That night, it became impossible to ignore. We were sitting inside, huddled together, when we heard scratching on the walls, slow and deliberate. Marcus swore he saw a shadow move across the room. Emily screamed, pointing at a corner where nothing should have been. I grabbed the lantern and shone it, and for a brief second, I saw him. A man, tall and gaunt, standing just at the edge of the firelight. His face was pale, eyes dark and empty, staring at us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And then he vanished. We didn't sleep that night. We sat in the living room, backs against the wall, watching the darkness outside the windows. Around 3 a.m, the knocking began again. This time it wasn't a light tap. It was heavy, insistent, as if someone, or something, was trying to break in. Josh grabbed a baseball bat, Emily was sobbing quietly, and Marcus and I were frozen, unsure of what to do. The knocking stopped suddenly, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around us. By first light, we decided we had no choice. We would leave, even if it meant abandoning the car and walking down the mountain. As we prepared to go, we discovered the front door, which had been locked securely the night before, now wide open. The air outside smelled of damp earth and decay. We gathered our things and started down the path, trying to keep calm. As we walked, I felt like we were being followed. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig set my nerves on edge. Marcus swore he could see a figure at the edge of the tree line, always keeping its distance, but never letting us out of sight. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes, and the road back to civilization seemed endless. Finally, as the sun rose higher, we saw headlights on the distant road. Relief washed over us, and we ran toward the clearing. But as we reached it, I glanced back, and there he was again, the man from the cabin, standing at the tree line watching us, expressionless. And then he disappeared. We made it to the nearest town and called the police, but when they investigated the area, there was nothing. No cabin, no effigies, no signs of anyone having been there. They chalked it up to our imagination, perhaps a prank by locals or some isolated survivalist encampment. But we knew what we had seen. The experience left a permanent mark on all of us. None of us spoke of it for years, fearing that telling the story might make it real again. To this day, I can't drive past that area of the Appalachians without feeling that same sense of being watched. I've tried to research the cabin, the clearing, the effigies, but there's no record. Emily refuses to go hiking in the mountains. Marcus keeps a crossbow in his apartment, saying it's just in case. And Josh refuses to talk about it at all. Sometimes late at night, when the wind is high and the branches scrape against my window, I think about that man, standing silently among the trees, and I wonder how many others have had the misfortune of encountering him. I've read about missing hikers, strange disappearances, and unsettling accounts from locals, and I can't help but feel that they're all connected somehow. That the cabin in the woods wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting. Waiting for us, waiting for anyone who dared to intrude. I don't know if it was a person, a spirit, or something else entirely, but I know the terror we felt was real. The isolation, the darkness, the feeling of being hunted, it wasn't just our imagination. I've never returned to the woods, and I never will. The memory is enough to keep me awake on countless nights, haunted by the shadows and the eyes that watched us from the darkness. Even now, when I close my eyes, I see the cabin's windows, dark and reflective, and I hear the whispering wind through the trees. I can still feel that presence just beyond the edge of sight, and it terrifies me more than anything else I've ever encountered. That weekend was supposed to be an escape, a simple adventure, but it became something far darker, a brush with something primal, ancient, and entirely indifferent to us. Years later, we still talk about it in hushed tones, avoiding the words that might make it real again. We don't joke about it, and we never will. Because whatever it was, whatever waits in those woods, it's patient and it remembers. And I have no doubt that, if we ever return, it will be waiting. Story the end. It was the last weekend of October when 5 friends from Ohio decided to rent a secluded cabin in the woods of northern Michigan. The group, all in their mid-20s, were used to weekend camping trips, but this cabin promised something different, a real escape, miles from the nearest town, with no neighbors close enough to hear a scream. They wanted quiet, the kind you only get when cell service disappears and the only lights are from the moon and stars. The cabin itself was small, a log structure with a stone chimney and a porch that creaked under even the slightest weight. The listing had made it seem charming. Rustic interiors, a wood-burning stove, and a lake a short walk away. They arrived in the late afternoon, the sun dropping low behind the trees, casting long, distorted shadows across the dirt road. Mark, the unofficial driver and planner of the trip, maneuvered the SUV onto the narrow driveway, and the tires crunched over the gravel, echoing oddly in the stillness. From the moment they stepped out, there was an uneasy quiet that none of them acknowledged. Sarah, the most cautious of the group, commented on the way the wind rustled through the trees. It sounded almost like whispering. But the others laughed it off, joking that the forest had secrets and that they should expect a few ghost stories. Inside, the cabin was dustier than the pictures had suggested. A layer of grime coated the shelves and cobwebs clung to the corners. The wood smelled faintly of damp and old pine. It was cozy enough, though, and once they started lighting the fire in the stove, the cabin began to feel alive. The friends unpacked, sharing beers and snacks, and eventually settled into a rhythm of casual chatter. As night fell, the forest outside seemed to grow thicker. The shadows stretched and the sounds of nocturnal animals filled the air. Owls calling, branches snapping, a distant rustle that could have been anything. It wasn't unusual until the noises began to mimic something closer to human movement. Footsteps in the underbrush, dragging and deliberate, punctuated by sudden pauses. "Guys, do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, eyes wide as the footsteps seemed to circle the cabin. "Probably just a deer," Ryan said, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. "I don't know," Sarah muttered. "It doesn't sound like a deer." The friends huddled near the stove, beers forgotten, listening. The steps stopped suddenly, replaced by a low thump against the wooden walls of the cabin. Something brushed against the outer door, soft but deliberate. "Maybe it's the wind," Mark said, though his words lacked conviction. They tried to convince themselves that the night sounds were natural. Eventually, the fire's warmth and the alcohol dulled their fear, and they fell asleep in the main room, couches pushed together, blankets shared. But sleep was shallow and uneasy. Around 2 a.m, Sarah awoke to a sound that froze her blood. The door to the cabin had opened silently, and a shadow loomed in the doorway. She froze, heart hammering. The shadow didn't move in the way a person would. It was wrong. Limbs seemed distorted, the shape just barely human. She blinked, and it was gone. Sarah shook the others awake, whispering frantically about what she'd seen. Mark and Ryan immediately jumped up, checking the locks and windows. Everything seemed fine. The porch light, powered by a small solar panel, flickered weakly. They tried to laugh it off, telling Sarah she had dreamed it, but she swore she hadn't. Morning brought a false sense of relief. The sun streamed through the cabin windows, and the forest looked calm, normal, even welcoming. They spent the day hiking, swimming in the lake, and trying to push away the lingering fear from the night. But that relief didn't last. That evening, as they prepared dinner over the wood stove, they noticed something strange. Deep scratches along the front door frame, gouges that looked recent and deliberate. Nobody admitted to doing it, and none of their gear could have caused them. The scratches formed no pattern, but they were aggressive, as if something had tried to claw its way in. By the time darkness fell, tension had seeped into every corner of the cabin. Phones had no signal, leaving them cut off from the outside world. Mark tried to be logical, saying it was likely a raccoon or bear, but even he had to admit the scratches were high enough to suggest something larger, something not quite natural. Dinner was tense and silent, broken only by the occasional snap of the fire. Then came the sounds again, footsteps circling the cabin, slow and methodical. At first, they thought it might be someone hiking, but the sounds didn't match any animal, and they definitely weren't on the dirt path that ran a few hundred feet from the cabin. The footsteps seemed almost to be studying them, pacing deliberately. Ryan tried calling for help using a satellite messenger app, but the device wouldn't send. Static hissed through the speaker, then silence. Mark wanted to investigate, to confront whatever was out there, but Sarah begged them not to. She could feel eyes on them watching, and that dread was infectious. Hours passed like this, a slow crawl of fear. At some point, a branch broke right outside the cabin, as if whatever was out there had moved. Then came a sound that made them all freeze. A low, guttural growl, followed by a whisper that sounded like something, was trying to imitate a human voice. Come out, it hissed. The group barricaded the doors as best they could, pushing furniture against them and holding each other close. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle outside the walls made them jump. Around 3 a.m, the fireplace suddenly flared, flames shooting higher than they should have. Smoke filled the room, choking them. And in that brief, blinding light, they saw it. A figure, hunched and dark, pressed against the window, watching. Limbs were too long and its face was obscured, but the presence radiated malevolence. Panic erupted. Mark grabbed a baseball bat, Ryan a cast-iron skillet, Sarah held a kitchen knife, and the fifth friend, Emily, started screaming hysterically. They tried to get out the back door, but it was stuck. Windows wouldn't budge. The figure didn't attack, it simply watched, moving with an almost inhuman grace, pressing itself against the glass as if testing them. Hours passed. The figure never left. Eventually, they huddled in a corner, too terrified to move. Dawn finally broke, and with it, a strange quiet. The figure was gone. The forest returned to its ordinary sounds, birds, rustling leaves, nothing threatening. The friends packed their things silently, not daring to speak until they were in the SUV, engines running. They drove for hours, trying to shake the lingering feeling of being followed. When they reached the nearest town, they checked into a motel, and Sarah insisted they report it to the local authorities. The sheriff listened politely, but there were no other reports from that area. Just an old cabin in the woods, he said. People say things happen out there, but I've never seen anything myself. Over the next few weeks, they all tried to return to normal life, but the experience haunted them. Sarah, especially, became obsessed with researching the cabin. She discovered that the property had a long history, dating back over 100 years. The land had been logged, abandoned, and then privately sold. There were accounts of missing hikers in the same forest, but details were vague, often dismissed as folklore. A recurring theme was always the same. People claimed to hear voices, footsteps, and something watching them from the woods. Ryan started having nightmares, vivid enough that he could recall them even after waking. He dreamt of the figure at the window, of scratches appearing on his bedroom door, of the whispering voice calling his name. Emily became withdrawn, refusing to go out after dark. Mark, who had always been practical, found himself jumping at shadows, checking locks repeatedly, and avoiding the woods entirely. Sarah, however, became obsessed. She went back online, looking for any record of the cabin, any news articles, anything that might explain what they had experienced. One evening, Sarah stumbled across an obscure forum post from someone claiming to have stayed in the same cabin decades earlier. The poster described identical experiences: footsteps circling the cabin, whispers at night, a dark figure watching from the windows. They ended their post with a warning. It waits. Always. Do not go back. Despite the warning, curiosity gnawed at Sarah. She contacted the rental company and discovered that the cabin had recently been sold to a new owner who claimed it was perfectly safe. No one mentioned the history, and no one seemed aware or willing to admit that previous renters had reported strange occurrences. Unable to resist, Sarah persuaded Mark and Ryan to return with her the following fall. Emily refused, citing fear that the experience would destroy her. The second trip was eerily quiet at first. The cabin appeared unchanged, though dust had settled and leaves cluttered the porch. They laughed nervously, trying to convince themselves that the first visit had been a product of imagination and fear. The first night passed without incident. But on the second night, subtle things began. Scratches on the wooden walls inside, odd reflections in the glass that didn't match their movements, whispers that seemed to come from the corners of the room. The tension escalated quickly, a silent terror that no one could rationalize. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, metallic and acrid, but grew stronger. Sarah felt nauseated. Mark and Ryan tried to ignore it, but they could no longer pretend. It seemed to emanate from the forest itself, the trees like gaping mouths. At 1:23 a.m., the power went out. Candles flared as if caught in a sudden wind, then went out. The forest outside became unnervingly silent, and then they heard it. Footsteps again, slow and measured, coming closer. Not across the porch, but inside. The cabin had only one main room. No one was moving. The air itself seemed heavy. The figure appeared once more at the window, just a shadow in the moonlight, longer and darker than before. Ryan swore he saw it move through the cabin walls, a flicker at the corner of his vision. Mark and Sarah clung to each other, too terrified to breathe. The figure whispered, a voice like gravel and ice, "Leave, or stay forever." They bolted, crashing through the back door, running blindly through the forest. The woods seemed to twist around them, paths unfamiliar, trees taller and more menacing. Behind them, branches cracked and snapped, and a guttural laugh echoed. They didn't stop until they reached the SUV, panting, bleeding from scratches they couldn't remember getting. The drive back to the highway was tense. Every shadow along the roadside seemed to mimic the dark figure. Once they reached town, they didn't speak of it. They returned to Ohio, scarred, wary, and unable to shake the feeling that something had followed them, or, worse, had been waiting for them to leave the cabin. Sarah continued her research from home, obsessed. She discovered old newspaper clippings about disappearances in the same forest, some dating back to the 1920s. Each victim had vanished without a trace, often last seen near the area of the cabin. Local folklore suggested the forest was cursed, haunted by a watcher, a presence that lingered near certain spots, always patient, always hungry for attention. Months later, Sarah received a package with no return address. Inside was a Polaroid, the cabin at night, the same porch where they had stayed, and in the window a shadow crouched, longer than any human, eyes glinting faintly. On the back of the photo, written in a scrawled hand, were 3 words, "We're waiting." The group never returned to the cabin again. Emily refused even to speak about it. Ryan moved to another state, unable to sleep without lights on, jumpy at every sound. Mark sold his SUV and avoided the outdoors altogether. Sarah, however, kept researching, visiting the police, the library, and online archives, trying to piece together the story. She knew something lived there, something patient, something intelligent enough to stalk and manipulate. Every year around Halloween, Sarah received a postcard. Always blank, except for the postmark from the area near the cabin. She didn't need to look to know what they said. She could feel it. A presence that lingered, watching, waiting. And every time she looked at the trees outside her window at night, she swore she saw it, just beyond the shadows, peering from the darkness. No one ever returned to that cabin. The rental listings vanished, and the area was eventually marked private. Locals whispered about it when outsiders asked, warning them to stay away, but most dismissed it as superstition. Those who knew better never spoke. The forest remained, dense and quiet, stretching for miles, and the cabin still stood, empty yet alive in some terrible way, waiting for the next group to seek solitude, only to realize too late that the forest had chosen them. Stories of scratches on doors, footsteps in the night, whispers calling out from the shadows, and fleeting glimpses of the dark figure continued to surface online. Hikers reported being followed, campers swore something was watching them, and hunters came back with tales of a presence that made the hairs on the back of their necks rise. Some believed it to be a spirit, others a predator of a type no one could explain. The truth remained elusive, shrouded in the forest, known only to those who had seen it with their own eyes. Years later, Sarah, older and more cautious, returned to the cabin's coordinates using satellite images. The cabin was gone, replaced by fallen trees and overgrown brush. But as she stared at the clearing, she felt the same oppressive weight, the same sense of eyes on her. She knew the cabin had never left. Not really. The presence lingered, patient, waiting for the next victims foolish enough to wander too deep into the woods. And in the quiet of her own home, she sometimes heard the faint sound of scratching just beyond the walls and the low whisper, "Come out! Come out!" Story the end. It was mid-October when we decided to take the trip. A group of 5 of us, myself, my brother Matt, my 2 childhood friends, Casey and Laura, and Matt's girlfriend Jessica, had been talking about renting a cabin in the woods for years, and finally, schedules and money aligned. The cabin was somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, about 3 hours north of our hometown. It was advertised online as secluded, rustic, and perfect for a weekend of getting away from it all. When we pulled up the narrow gravel road, lined with trees already shedding golden leaves, it felt exactly like that. Perfect, isolated, quiet in a way that felt unreal. The cabin itself was small, maybe 2 bedrooms and a loft, with a stone fireplace in the main living area and a wraparound porch. It had that rustic charm you expect from vacation rentals, though there was a faint musty smell, like the place hadn't been aired out for months. The first evening was easy. We brought groceries in, lit a fire, and drank beer while sitting around the living room. The forest around us was almost dark black, the trees thick enough that the moonlight barely reached the ground. It was quiet except for the wind brushing through the branches and the occasional crow cawing. None of us noticed the first small things: tiny scratches on the wooden floor near the back door, a half-broken window that didn't lock all the way the shadows of the trees looked like they were moving faster than the wind should have been pushing them. We stayed up late that night, talking, telling stories, and drinking. Matt and I had brought a small Bluetooth speaker and were listening to music. Around midnight, Casey went to the bathroom, and when he returned, he said he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching the cabin. We laughed it off as a deer, or maybe one of the other campers from a property down the road. There weren't supposed to be any other houses within a mile, but none of us really thought much of it. By the second day, we decided to hike a trail that supposedly looped around a small creek. It was steep and muddy from recent rain, and as we walked, the sun dappled through the leaves in a way that made everything beautiful and eerie at once. Laura was the first to notice something off. "It feels like someone is following us," she said, scanning the forest behind us. We joked about it, saying maybe it was just a hunter or a hiker. Still, none of us liked the idea of being alone out there. By the time we looped back, we were more on edge than we admitted, and when we got back to the cabin, I noticed that the back door, locked when we left, was slightly ajar. No one said anything, but Matt and I quickly checked the perimeter. Nothing. No footprints other than ours in the soft dirt outside. We chalked it up to the lock being loose. That night, the unease only grew. Around 2 a.m., we all woke up to the sound of someone or something walking on the porch. It was slow, deliberate steps, pacing back and forth. Matt whispered that it might be a raccoon or a squirrel, but the steps were too heavy, too human-sounding. Jessica insisted we lock the doors again. When we checked, all doors were locked, but then we noticed something strange. Faint handprints on the fogged-over glass of the front window, as if someone had been pressing their hands against it, looking in. No one admitted to it, but we all felt that first real twinge of fear. None of us slept the rest of the night. The next morning, we considered leaving, but it was too far to just turn around. We tried to shake off the fear, laughing and making breakfast, joking about ghosts and cabin-in-the-woods cliches. We decided to explore further, following another trail that led deeper into the forest. About an hour in, we came across an old, dilapidated shack, hidden almost completely by trees. It looked abandoned, rotting wood, broken windows, but what was strange were the carvings on the door. Not initials or dates, but crude symbols that didn't make sense. Casey wanted to check it out, joking about finding treasure, but I felt a sudden overwhelming sense of dread, like looking at it was somehow wrong. Laura was visibly shaken and wanted to leave immediately. Matt tried to calm her, but As we turned around, we noticed something disturbing. Footprints, too large to be any of us, circled the shack and then disappeared into the trees, going in every direction. None of us had noticed them coming in. We hurried back to the cabin, and the feeling didn't go away. That night, things escalated. Around 1 a.m., we heard scratching inside the cabin, slow, deliberate moving from the kitchen toward the living room. We grabbed whatever we could as weapons, baseball bats, a knife, a cast iron pan, and cautiously went to investigate. Nothing. No broken windows, no doors open, just the scratching, faint but distinct as if something were tapping its nails against the wooden walls. Then, as we all huddled together in the living room, we heard a voice whispering. It wasn't words, not exactly. More like someone trying to imitate speech, but failing, a distorted guttural sound that came from the loft. Jessica fainted from fear, and we all held her as best we could, too terrified to move. By sunrise, exhaustion took over. We tried to rationalize it. Wind through the trees, an animal trapped in the attic. We searched the loft and found nothing. That afternoon, Casey and I decided to check the perimeter again. As we walked behind the cabin, we found strange markings carved into the trees, not initials or words, just symbols, matching the ones on the shack door. Around the base of the trees were small piles of dirt arranged in odd patterns, almost like mini altars. It was beyond eerie, and I suddenly remembered that the area was said to have had a logging town long ago, now completely abandoned. No one could explain why someone, or something, would still be here, deep in the forest. That evening, the horror intensified. The fire we built outside to cook dinner was extinguished by what felt like a sudden gust of wind, but the air was calm. Then the sounds started again. Footsteps circling the cabin, whispering from the trees, scratching along the walls. Matt tried to record it on his phone, but the files came out corrupted, or the audio had strange static over it. By 11 p.m., we were all too scared to stay in one room together. We decided someone should stay awake to watch, taking turns sitting on the porch with a flashlight. As I sat out there, the trees seemed alive, shadows moving in ways they shouldn't. Then I saw it, a figure at the far edge of the clearing, thin, unnaturally tall, wearing what looked like tattered clothing. Its eyes reflected the flashlight in a way that made them glow red. I froze. It didn't move toward me, but it didn't leave either. When I blinked, it was gone. We made a decision then. We had to leave. The trucks were parked a quarter-mile down the gravel road, and the sun was barely rising. We packed quickly, ignoring breakfast or anything else. But as we stepped outside, the road seemed different. Narrower, longer, and darker than it had the day before. Branches blocked the path in ways that hadn't been there, and every time we looked back at the cabin, we felt like it had grown larger, looming over us. We ran the quarter mile, not looking back. And when we finally got into the trucks, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin wasn't there. In its place, there was only a clearing, sun-dappled trees, and nothing that looked remotely like a structure. It took hours to rationalize what we'd seen. We drove back to town, each of us silent, except for occasional muttered reassurances. Once back, I tried to research the area. No abandoned cabin listings, no missing person reports, nothing about a shack with strange carvings. It was as if the cabin, the shack, and the forest itself had been fabricated for us. But the scratches on the back door, the handprints on the window, the carvings on the trees, those were real. Everyone in the group has scars from that night in ways you wouldn't expect. Not physical, but psychological. Matt has refused to camp since. Casey and Laura both have sleep disorders, nightmares that involve the cabin and the figure in the trees. Jessica won't go near forests at all. And me, I still can't drive through rural Appalachian roads without gripping the wheel so tight it hurts, always expecting to see something at the edge of the trees. Years later, we met up to compare memories. Oddly, none of us saw the exact same things, though the feelings were identical. Shadows, figures, whispers, handprints, footprints, scratching, all shared experiences. But the cabin itself? No one else could remember its exact size, its windows, the porch. It was as if our minds had collectively filled in the details, except for the parts that were undeniably real, the symbols on the trees, the disturbed earth behind the shack, the sound recordings that refused to play. Sometimes I wonder if the forest itself is alive in some way, feeding on fear, or if it's another plane intersecting with ours just enough to let something in. We never went back, and none of us have told anyone the full story, because who would believe it? But every October, when the wind picks up and the leaves swirl in that unnatural way, I feel the presence of that place again. It's a feeling in your chest, your stomach knotting, your hair standing on end, like someone or something is watching, just beyond the edge of your vision, waiting for you to notice it. And I do notice. Every time. I still have the handprints. Not on a window this time, not on a door. They're in my mind, imprinted permanently, showing up in dreams, in reflections, in the dark corners of empty rooms. I can see the figure sometimes, tall and thin, in the peripheral vision of my memory, and I know that no amount of rationalization will ever erase it. I don't know what it wanted, or if it wanted anything at all. But I know it's still out there, and I know that if I ever go back into those mountains, even just a little too deep into the forest, it will be waiting. Some nights, when the wind whistles through the trees outside my window, I hear faint scratching, faint whispers, and I remember that first night at the cabin, sitting in terror as the figure watched me from the darkness. I remember how small and powerless we felt, 5 people together, and still it was enough to make us break. And the thing is, I think that's the point. It doesn't need to harm you directly. It just needs to make you feel like you're not alone, and that alone is enough to drive fear into the deepest part of your mind where you can never escape it. Matt, Casey, Laura, Jessica, and I, we all have different ways of coping. Some of us pretend it didn't happen. Some of us write it off as a collective hallucination or a prank played by some sick person. None of it makes sense because the evidence exists in ways you can't explain. The carvings, the footprints, the disturbed dirt, the sounds, those things are proof that what we experienced was real. And yet, try as we might to convince ourselves or others, no one can see it. The world doesn't acknowledge it, but we do. We never speak about it openly, not because we're ashamed, but because the moment you speak about it, you invite it back. You give it power again. Even now, years later, if someone were to ask me about the cabin, I wouldn't lie, but I wouldn't go into details either. The forest doesn't forgive attention. It waits in silence until someone is distracted, vulnerable, and alone enough to notice. Then it's there again, subtle, unrelenting, patient. And that's the scariest part, knowing that somewhere out there it's still watching, still marking, still waiting. Story the end. It was the last weekend in October when a group of 6 friends, Kyle, Amanda, Ryan, Sophie, Matt, and Jenna, decided to escape the city for a cabin getaway in the mountains of western Pennsylvania. They had rented a small, secluded cabin through an online site, one of those listings that promised total privacy and rustic charm. For them, the idea of isolation was perfect. No crowds, no noise, no responsibilities, just a weekend to relax before the brutal pace of the holiday season. The drive was long, winding up steep, tree-lined roads that became narrower and darker as the sun dipped behind the mountains. When they arrived, the cabin was everything the listing promised. A 2-story wooden structure with a stone chimney, a wraparound porch, and tall pine trees all around. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of decaying leaves and pine sap. The place was quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural. No birds, no insects, no distant traffic, just silence. They unpacked, carried groceries inside, and lit a fire in the stone fireplace. Amanda, who had always been the most practical of the group, checked the locks and windows while the rest began arranging sleeping spaces. Jenna and Sophie claimed the loft upstairs. Kyle and Amanda took the master bedroom, and Ryan and Matt took the remaining room. The cabin had electricity, but cell phone service was patchy, something they all thought would be part of the charm. That first night, they stayed up late, drinking, talking, and playing cards. The fire crackled, and shadows danced on the wooden walls. Everything was normal, or so they thought. At around 2 a.m., Kyle, who had stepped outside to grab more firewood, heard a faint noise behind the cabin. At first, he thought it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound was rhythmic, almost deliberate, a crunching of leaves under heavy boots. He shined his flashlight toward the tree line, but saw nothing. The forest was dense, and the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally. When he returned inside, he brushed it off. The others were asleep, and he told himself he had imagined it. But as the fire died down and silence enveloped the cabin, he could swear he heard it again, the same slow, deliberate steps moving around the cabin. His stomach turned cold. He shook it off and went to bed. The following morning, they all noticed that some of the food they had unpacked was slightly out of place. A cereal box was open, a bag of chips was ripped, small items moved just enough to notice. Ryan laughed it off as a prank, but Kyle's unease grew. As they hiked a nearby trail in the late morning, the forest felt oppressive. The trees were unusually dense, the undergrowth thick, and every few minutes it seemed as though the wind carried whispers just out of earshot. Sophie insisted it was the wind and shadows playing tricks on them, but Amanda felt it too, a cold, watching presence that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. By evening, the tension had built. The group made dinner and tried to laugh it off, but nobody could shake the feeling that they weren't alone. As they settled into bed, Matt whispered that he thought he saw someone standing at the edge of the porch earlier. No one believed him at first, until a sudden loud thump came from the loft above. Sophie and Jenna screamed, and the others rushed upstairs. Nothing was there, but one of the windows in the loft was wide open. They had all locked the doors and windows before bed, but somehow it was now unlocked. Panic began to seep into the group. They debated leaving, but the roads had become slick with rain, and the nearest town was over 30 minutes away. They decided to stay together, keeping the lights on and the doors locked. But as the night deepened, so did the strange occurrences. Amanda woke to the sound of whispering just outside her bedroom door. She called out, but no one answered. When she finally worked up the courage to look, the door was slightly ajar, though she had locked it herself. Kyle tried to rationalize everything. "It's a raccoon, a prank, something explainable," he said. But even he could not deny the feeling of being watched, the shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should, moving against the light. He went outside to check the perimeter, carrying a flashlight and a kitchen knife, but all he found was the forest, dense, silent, and unyielding. By the third night, the stress and fear were taking a toll. Ryan refused to sleep in the cabin and instead opted to camp in the small tent they had brought, set up just a few feet from the cabin. Around midnight, the group heard him scream. They rushed outside to find him pale, shaking, and pointing into the woods. "It's out there! It's watching me!" he gasped. But when they shone their flashlights into the forest, there was nothing, no movement, no sound, just the blackness between the trees. The group argued about leaving. Jenna wanted to go immediately, but Kyle insisted that they pack in the morning, thinking it safer to travel during daylight. As they tried to sleep, a new sound began, scraping, dragging, like claws against the wooden exterior of the cabin. It circled the structure, slow, deliberate, methodical. The friends huddled together in the living room, listening, hearts hammering. At 3 a.m., the power went out. Candles flickered to life, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The scratching grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. Amanda wanted to scream, but Kyle grabbed her arm. "Stay quiet," he whispered. "Whatever it is, it doesn't want us to see it." Hours passed, though it felt like days. Every so often, the growling stopped, replaced by the faintest whispers, unintelligible but undeniably human. Sophie claimed she saw a figure moving past the window, tall, unnaturally thin, and pale, with limbs bending at impossible angles. When the others looked, it was gone. By sunrise, the group was exhausted, terror-stricken, and desperate. They packed silently, leaving behind everything except what they could carry. As they started the car, Kyle noticed footprints leading from the edge of the woods to the cabin's front porch. They were enormous, human-like, but distorted. The toes too long, the heel elongated. Amanda snapped a photo, but when they later tried to show it to anyone, the image was inexplicably corrupted. Driving away, the friends tried to talk, tried to rationalize the events, but each of them felt the same dread, that whatever had been in those woods had followed them, watching from a distance, waiting. Over the following weeks, nightmares plagued them. In dreams, they were back in the cabin, trapped, unable to escape. The figure from the forest would appear in different corners, the tilting its head, whispering unintelligible words, growing ever closer. When they woke, some found scratches on their arms, bruises in strange patterns, or small items moved from their place. Ryan moved to another state, hoping distance would help. But one night he woke to see a tall, thin figure standing at the end of his bed. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, its face obscured in shadows, and though it didn't speak, he felt its gaze, piercing and cold. He tried to wake his neighbors, his friends, anyone, but when he looked back, it was gone. Sophie quit her job and left the city, hoping that isolation would keep her safe, but even then the nightmares persisted. She would wake at 3 a.m., hearing faint scratching against walls, whispering voices, and the unmistakable sound of deliberate footsteps circling her apartment. Months later, they spoke again as a group, cautiously, nervously. Each had experienced something unexplainable since that cabin trip, and it had begun to consume their lives. They avoided forests, camping trips, and even vacations to rural areas. When news came of missing hikers in Pennsylvania or Ohio, their hearts raced, because they knew that something in the woods waited, intelligent, patient, always watching. Then one night, Kyle received a text from an unknown number. It contained a single message: "You can't hide." Panic overtook him. His apartment felt smaller, suffocating, every shadow deeper, every sound amplified. He tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself it was a prank, but when he glanced out the window, he saw it. The tall, thin figure standing at the edge of the woods in the distant park behind his building, tilting its head, watching. Amanda, Jenna, and the others were terrified for him, but nothing any of them could do stopped it. Whatever had been in those woods, whatever had haunted them in that cabin, had followed. Kyle tried to flee, moving to another city, but the sense of being watched never left. Sometimes, when he was alone, he would hear the faint crunch of leaves underfoot, a whisper just out of reach, and he would see shadows bending in impossible ways. Even years later, the group remains fractured. Some talk occasionally, but every conversation circles back to that cabin, that forest, that figure that defied explanation. They avoid the woods entirely. They avoid places where isolation is possible. But the memory of those footsteps, the growls, the whispers, the impossibly tall figure with limbs that bent inhumanly has become a permanent scar. Some nights they cannot sleep, and in those nights each of them swears they hear it, outside their window, in the corner of their room, circling silently, waiting. They don't speak of it to anyone else for fear of disbelief or ridicule, but deep down, they know the truth. Whatever they encountered in that cabin wasn't human. It wasn't an animal. It was something older, patient, and unrelenting, and it would never stop watching. The cabin was never rented again, as far as they could find. The website listing vanished without explanation. Locals spoke of the area as cursed, haunted, a place where hikers vanish, campers disappear, and travelers lose their minds. But the friends know the reality. That cabin, those woods, were home to something that had found them and would not let them go. Even now, years later, each of them carries the same fear, the same certainty. They avoid forests, but they cannot escape the memory. The footsteps in the night, the whispers just beyond comprehension, the feeling of being watched, all of it lingers. And they know that somewhere, deep in the woods of Pennsylvania, that figure waits, patient, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to wander too deep. They warn each other quietly, occasionally in messages, sometimes in dreams, that there are places in the woods where you should never go. But the story is theirs alone, a secret that haunts them, because to speak it aloud might draw attention. And they know, as surely as they breathe, that whatever they faced in that cabin in the woods is still out there, and it never forgets. Story, the end. It was a chilly September afternoon when 4 college friends, Jake, Megan, Chris, and Laura, set out from Boston for a weekend getaway in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. The cabin they rented was secluded, tucked deep in the forest, a rustic wooden structure that promised solitude and a break from their hectic lives. Jake, always the thrill-seeker, had insisted on a remote location, claiming that the isolation would be perfect for disconnecting and relaxing. Megan, who had reluctantly agreed, only hoped they wouldn't run into trouble. Chris and Laura were excited, but neither could shake the unease they felt as they drove farther from the main roads. The drive itself was long and winding, with tall trees on either side and the occasional glimpse of a river cutting through the forest. They passed through a few small towns, but the closer they got to the cabin, the more deserted the roads became. Finally, as the sun dipped below the tree line, they arrived at the cabin. It was smaller than the photos suggested, a 2-story wooden structure with a stone chimney and a wraparound porch. The forest closed in around it, and the absence of other buildings or lights gave it a sense of isolation that made Megan shiver. "This is beautiful," Laura said, trying to sound enthusiastic, though her voice trembled slightly. Jake grinned, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "Exactly what I wanted. Perfect for a weekend in the woods." Inside, the cabin smelled of old pine and dust. The main room had a stone fireplace, a worn sofa, and a small dining table. A narrow staircase led to the second floor, where 2 bedrooms and a tiny bathroom were located. They unpacked quickly, eager to settle in before dark. As they started a fire in the fireplace, Chris pulled out his phone to check for a signal. "Nothing," he said after a few minutes. "No bars at all, just what you'd expect in the middle of the woods." Megan frowned. "Great. Just hope we don't need an ambulance or something." As darkness fell, they cooked dinner over a small propane stove, the cabin illuminated by the fire and a few battery-powered lanterns. The forest outside was alive with sounds: crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustling of leaves in the wind. They laughed and joked to keep the mood light, but a tension lingered, subtle but persistent. After dinner, Jake suggested they explore the woods briefly. "Just a short walk," he said. "We'll see how far the trail goes." Megan hesitated, but Chris and Laura were intrigued. They grabbed flashlights and slipped into the trees. The forest was dense, and the beams from their flashlights cut through the darkness in thin cones of light. They followed a narrow path, the air growing colder as they moved deeper into the woods. After about 15 minutes, Jake stopped abruptly. "Wait, do you hear that?" A faint rustling echoed through the trees. At first, they thought it was a deer or a small animal, but then the sound grew heavier, more deliberate. Leaves and twigs crunched underfoot somewhere just out of sight. "Probably just a raccoon," Chris said, though his voice lacked conviction. They continued walking, but the rustling kept pace with them, as though someone or something was following. Laura started to panic. "Let's go back. Now." They turned around, but the path seemed different somehow, twisted in ways it hadn't been before. They walked faster, flashlights scanning the trees, but there was no sign of the trail leading back to the cabin. The forest seemed to close in, branches snagging their clothes, the air growing thicker. Then, without warning, a scream rang out. It was sharp, terrified, and distinctly human. They froze. "Jake?" Megan called, her voice trembling. No answer. Another scream, closer this time, echoed through the trees. They ran blindly, branches tearing at their arms and faces, until they burst back into a small clearing. But it wasn't the cabin. This clearing was unfamiliar, ringed by tall pines, the ground littered with broken branches and rocks. And then they saw it, footprints in the mud, deep and wide, leading into the forest. Not just human footprints. These were larger, heavier, almost unnatural. Panic set in. They turned and ran again, following the tracks as best they could, desperate to find the cabin. But the forest twisted and turned, loops forming that seemed to defy logic. Hours, or maybe minutes. Time lost, all meaning passed. Finally, they stumbled back onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, only to find the place dark and silent. The door was slightly ajar. Chris reached for the doorknob, but Megan grabbed his arm. "Wait, something's off." Inside, the cabin appeared untouched. No signs of forced entry. No overturned furniture. Only the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air, though the fireplace had gone cold. They called out for Jake, but there was no response. As night deepened, strange things began to happen. First, they heard whispers, soft and unintelligible, coming from the corners of the room. The wind outside seemed to carry voices, murmuring their names. The fire flickered and dimmed, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Megan swore she saw movement in the shadows, figures just at the edge of her vision, vanishing when she looked directly at them. By the second night, the unease had escalated. Objects moved on their own, chairs shifting slightly, doors creaking open when they had been closed. The air grew colder, and frost began forming on the window panes, even though the heater was on. They tried to rationalize it as drafts or imagination, but the feeling of being watched was inescapable. At one point, they heard a scratching from the walls upstairs. Laura, terrified, insisted they investigate. Chris went first, flashlight in hand. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under his weight. At the top, he found nothing, just the empty hallway and the 2 bedrooms. But when he turned to go back down, the door to the attic was slightly open. He hadn't noticed it before. The attic was cramped, dusty, filled with old furniture and cobwebs. But in the corner, something moved. A dark shape, hunched and still. Chris shined his flashlight directly at it, and the shape darted across the room, disappearing behind the stairs. He stumbled back down in terror. That night, they decided they had to leave. They packed a few belongings, prepared to drive back to the nearest town. But when they tried to start the car, the engine sputtered and died. Chris checked the hood, but nothing was visibly wrong. They were miles from civilization, surrounded by dense forest and no cell signal. Megan suggested they walk back to the road to flag down a passing car. Jake agreed, though the tension in the air was palpable. They grabbed flashlights and headed into the woods, careful to stick to the trails. Hours passed and the forest seemed endless. Trees loomed overhead, shadows twisting unnaturally. They began to notice strange markings on the trees, scratches, deep and jagged, forming shapes that resembled symbols or letters. Then came the whispers again, calling their names, soft at first, then louder, insistent. The voices seemed to come from all directions, circling them. Megan screamed, running blindly, and Chris followed, trying to keep sight of her flashlight. They stumbled into a clearing and froze. There, in the center, was the cabin. But it looked wrong. Older, more decayed, as if it had been abandoned for decades. The windows were dark, the wood rotting, and yet they could hear something moving inside. The whispers grew louder, now joined by low, guttural growls. They tried to run, but the forest seemed to shift around them, paths looping back impossibly. They were trapped. And then they saw them, shadows moving inside the cabin, figures with distorted limbs, faces obscured but somehow familiar. The air grew thick, cold, and suffocating. They barricaded themselves in the living room, hoping to survive until morning. The night was long, filled with the sounds of scratching, whispering, and the occasional scream from somewhere deep within the cabin. Objects flew across the room, and the shadows pressed against them, intangible yet oppressive. By dawn, they were exhausted, barely coherent. When the first light filtered through the windows, the noises stopped. The forest outside was quiet, unnaturally so. They ventured outside cautiously, only to find that the forest had shifted again. The cabin was there, but the paths back to the main road had vanished. Days passed, or maybe it was only one day. Time had lost meaning. They survived on what little food and water they had brought, always aware of the eyes watching from the trees. Sometimes at night, they would hear Jake's voice calling to them from the woods, though he had disappeared during the first night's chaos. Eventually, a hiker stumbled upon the cabin and noticed the four of them wandering the woods, delirious, muttering about shadows and whispers. He called for help, and a ranger team arrived. But when they searched the surrounding forest, they found no evidence of Jake. The paths through the woods were inconsistent, loops and dead ends everywhere, as if the forest itself had shifted to trap them. The friends were taken back to town, traumatized, and received counseling. They recounted their story to authorities, but no one could explain the strange occurrences. The cabin was investigated, but no paranormal activity was officially confirmed. The markings on the trees were gone, the footprints vanished, and the strange frost inside the cabin had melted. Years later, the cabin was abandoned again, left to rot in the forest. Locals told stories of lights flickering inside at night, of whispers that carried on the wind, and of figures glimpsed moving in the shadows. Some who dared venture near reported hearing their names being called, soft at first, then insistent, as though the forest itself was reaching out. The four friends never returned to the woods, and none of them spoke of what truly happened, at least not all at once. The terror of those nights remained, lodged deep in their memories, a constant shadow in their waking lives. And the cabin, standing silently in the heart of the forest, waited for the next group foolish enough to enter its domain. The forest is patient, and it never forgets. Those who enter may leave, but they never truly escape. The shadows linger, the whispers continue, and the cabin waits, a silent predator in the woods, hungry for the next soul to wander too far from the safety of the road. Story the end. It started as an idea, something that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. Four friends renting a cabin in the Pennsylvania woods for a weekend. The plan was simple: escape the city, disconnect, hike, drink, and tell stories by the fire. It was late September, the kind of time when the air smells like wet leaves and pine sap, and the sun sits low in the sky, even in the afternoon. I had been home in the northern part of the state, where my parents live, and my friends, Michael, Sarah, and Jason, had never really experienced the kind of isolation these forests could offer. We set out Friday morning, packed with backpacks, a cooler full of beer and snacks, and a bag of marshmallows for the fire. The drive was uneventful at first, highways and two-lane roads, the kind that wind past farms and small towns. But soon, the directions led us to gravel roads, then dirt roads, and finally a narrow path lined with towering pines. We passed a creek on the left, the water dark and moving fast, and I remembered the owner's warning. If you reach the creek, you've gone too far. We didn't reach it, but we were close enough for the landscape to feel foreign. The cabin looked smaller than the pictures online suggested. 2 stories, with wood siding weathered gray, a stone chimney, and windows that seemed to stare at us like dark eyes. A small porch wrapped around the front, and the forest came right up to the edges of the clearing, so thick it looked like a wall. The air smelled of pine, damp wood, and a faint muskiness that hinted at age. We unpacked quickly, eager to explore before the sun disappeared behind the trees. The interior was rustic, mostly empty, except for the essentials: a sagging couch, a wooden dining table with 4 chairs, and a kitchen with a gas stove but no microwave. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms with thin mattresses and blankets folded at the foot of each bed. The bathroom was small, with a clawfoot tub that looked almost ornamental. We didn't spend much time inside anyway. The woods were calling. We decided on a short hike to stretch our legs. The trail behind the cabin was narrow, covered with fallen leaves, and lined with ferns. At first it felt normal. Autumn woods, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot, birds calling overhead. But as we walked, I noticed how the trail twisted and turned, the path splitting repeatedly. We tried to mark our route with small sticks, but soon we realized that no matter which way we went, it felt like the trail doubled back on itself. Every turn looked the same. Every tree seemed familiar, yet nothing was recognizable. "This isn't too bad," Michael said, trying to keep the mood light, though I noticed a tremor in his voice. "We just go straight back the way we came." But when we attempted to retrace our steps, we found ourselves deeper in the woods, as if the forest had shifted overnight. Sarah joked that maybe the trees were moving, and Jason laughed along, though the tension was palpable. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun had dropped low. We decided to make dinner and light a fire in the fireplace. As the flames crackled, the wind outside began to pick up, whistling through the trees in long, drawn-out tones. It sounded almost like a voice, distant and distorted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was listening. We sat around the fire, drinking, laughing, telling stories, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. I woke around 2 a.m., the kind of wakefulness that feels like an intrusion into your own body. I lay there, listening to the wind, and that's when I heard it. Soft thumps outside, deliberate and spaced too evenly for an animal. I nudged Sarah, who shared my room, but she was already awake, wide-eyed. "It's probably just a raccoon," she whispered. I wanted to believe her, but the sound didn't stop. Then came the scratching, light at first, then insistent, at the cabin door. My pulse quickened. The next morning I mentioned it to Michael and Jason over breakfast. They laughed, suggesting it was just the wind, but Sarah's unease didn't fade. "It wasn't the wind," she said. "It was human." I didn't argue. Something about her tone made me keep quiet. We spent the day hiking deeper into the forest, trying to follow a stream we hoped would lead back to the road. The forest was dense, trails barely visible, and we soon found ourselves disoriented. That's when we came across a collapsed cabin, its wood rotted and overgrown with moss. Strange symbols were etched into the doorframe, lines, circles, shapes that didn't make sense. Michael said it was probably old hunter marks, but Sarah and I felt an immediate chill. That night, the wind had grown stronger. We tried to stay close to the fire, talking, but around 11 p.m. we heard it, scratching at the windows. Light at first, playful almost, then more insistent. We stayed inside, hearts racing, until a low, guttural growl started. Something was circling the cabin. Its footsteps were deliberate, heavy. Jason tried to peer out a window, but all he saw was darkness. We stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to sleep. Morning brought uneasy relief. We decided to hike out, hoping to leave early, but the forest seemed altered in daylight. Paths we thought we knew disappeared. Every sound, the snapping of twigs, rustling leaves, made us jump. Hours passed. Panic set in as we realized we were lost. It was then that we saw the footprints. Large, elongated, not human, and set far apart as if the creature could move with terrifying speed. They led us to another clearing where the remnants of a cabin lay destroyed. Walls splintered, furniture overturned, ashes scattered. In the center, a circle etched into the dirt, surrounded by symbols like the ones we had seen before. Burnt scraps of cloth were scattered within, and the scent of decay lingered. We didn't linger. The forest felt alive, pressing in, watching. Sunlight faded, shadows lengthened. We tried to follow a stream, thinking it would lead back to the road, but every turn led deeper into undergrowth. By nightfall, we had no choice but to stay together, moving cautiously through the darkness. Then we heard it again, footsteps, circling, slow and deliberate. Breathing, low and ragged, followed the rhythm of the steps. We ran blindly, branches clawing at our clothes and skin. A faint light appeared in a clearing. At first, we thought it might be the cabin, but it was too weak, flickering like a candle. As we drew closer, we saw the figure, tall, thin, head tilted unnaturally, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It began walking toward us deliberately, the steps crunching leaves underfoot. We fled, exhaustion driving us forward, until we collapsed near a small stream. The footsteps stopped, and silence descended like a weight. We stayed there, huddled together until morning. When we finally emerged from the woods, we were near a road. Civilization, normality, and safety, but nothing could erase what we had experienced. We never returned for our gear. The cabin remained behind, a silent, looming structure in the heart of a forest that seemed to shift, watch, and remember. Even years later, I can hear those footsteps in my dreams, feel the weight of the forest pressing in, smell the damp pine and rot. I know what we encountered was not human, not animal, and not meant for our world. Some part of me believes the forest is alive, and whatever walked its paths that weekend is still out there, waiting. Story the end. It started with a road trip that was supposed to be simple. My friends and I, Sarah, Kevin, and Matt, had been talking about renting a cabin in the mountains of Vermont for months. We wanted a weekend away from work, away from the city, away from everything. The internet listing made the cabin look quaint, a 2-story wooden structure tucked into a clearing, surrounded by dense forest. There were promises of quiet, privacy, and a fireplace for the cold autumn nights. None of the pictures showed the isolation, the thick blanket of trees that swallowed the sun by late afternoon, or the narrow, winding road that led to it. We left Friday morning, crammed into my old SUV, music blasting, laughter filling the car. The closer we got to the mountains, the smaller the roads became, and the GPS increasingly suggested dubious shortcuts that seemed to end in nothing but dirt paths and overgrown trails. Kevin, always the skeptic, kept insisting we were definitely taking a wrong turn, but I reassured him that this was just part of the adventure. By the time we reached the cabin, it was late afternoon and the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, leaving a kind of orange haze that felt both beautiful and ominous. The cabin itself looked slightly different than online photos. The wood was darker, aged, and weathered by decades of harsh seasons. The porch sagged in the middle, the windows were smudged, and the chimney had no cap. Yet inside, it was cozy. Basic furniture, a small kitchen, 2 bedrooms, a living room with a stone fireplace. The air smelled faintly of dust and damp wood. We unpacked quickly, eager to settle in before night fell, and decided to go for a short hike before dinner. The trail behind the cabin led us through a thick forest. The trees were tall and densely packed. Sunlight barely touched the ground. Birds called intermittently, and somewhere in the distance, a creek gurgled. We laughed and joked, taking pictures, but the deeper we went, the quieter it became. Not just quiet in the way a forest is quiet, but a weighty, unnatural quiet, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Kevin started making nervous comments about feeling watched, and Sarah rolled her eyes, brushing it off. I felt it too, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, but told myself it was just nerves. When we returned to the cabin, night had fallen. We built a fire in the fireplace and cooked simple meals, drinking beer and trying to shake off the tension from the hike. Around 10 o'clock, we started hearing it, A faint knocking sound from outside, soft at first, like branches hitting the cabin. Kevin went to the window to check and insisted he saw a shadow darting past the tree line. I laughed, trying to dismiss it, but even I felt the hairs on my arms rise. The knocking continued through the night, intermittently, sometimes on the roof, sometimes against the walls. Sleep was fitful. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of soft footsteps in the kitchen. My bedroom was closest to the living room, so I could hear every creak of the floorboards. I sat up, listening, and then froze. There was a pause, and then a soft whisper, "Go!" I didn't move, too terrified to even breathe. Eventually the footsteps stopped, but the fear lingered, settling into my chest like a stone. The next morning, we tried to rationalize what happened. Sarah joked about sleepwalking, Kevin suggested animals, and Matt avoided eye contact entirely. We decided to go for another hike, hoping that movement and daylight would distract us from the cabin's oppressive atmosphere. As we walked, we found remnants of what appeared to be older cabins long abandoned, trees growing through the ruins, rusted tools scattered, and graffiti carved into wooden beams. It was unsettling, but the forest itself seemed almost benign during the day. Back at the cabin, things escalated. Kevin discovered footprints in the dirt near the back porch that were too large to be any of ours. They seemed fresh, but led into the woods and disappeared. Sarah started mentioning hearing whispers from outside, voices too faint to understand. By late afternoon, the knocking returned, louder and more deliberate than the previous night. That evening, we locked all doors and windows, piled chairs against the front door, and tried to convince ourselves it was just paranoia. Around midnight, the temperature in the cabin dropped sharply. Our breaths came out in visible puffs. We heard dragging sounds above the loft area where Matt was sleeping. He called down to us in a shaky voice, saying he could hear something moving, but when we went upstairs, nothing was there. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the kitchen. We rushed in and found that the fridge door had been forced open and its contents spilled across the floor. The knocking turned into pounding, now coming from every side of the cabin. Whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls, sometimes distinctly saying, "Leave," sometimes garbled. We tried the front door. It wouldn't open. Chairs hadn't been moved, but the lock wouldn't budge. Panic overtook us. We ran to the windows, discovering that they were all locked from the inside, too. It was impossible. Something or someone was inside. The hours that followed were a blur of terror. We heard footsteps circling us, whispers that seemed to come from within our own minds, and glimpses of movement in the shadows. At one point, Matt screamed that a hand had grabbed his ankle, but when we turned, there was no one there. Sarah's phone, which had no signal, began ringing with static. The air was thick, oppressive, and cold. It felt alive. By dawn, the cabin fell silent. We were exhausted, trembling, but we managed to pry open a window and escape. We ran down the dirt path to the main road, the forest behind us now bathed in early light, appearing almost normal. None of us spoke during the drive back to civilization. The experience was too real, too vivid to dismiss. Weeks later, we tried contacting the cabin rental service. They claimed nothing unusual had happened at that property, dismissing our account as exaggerated. But after researching the area, we uncovered that a family had vanished from the cabin decades earlier. Their disappearance had been mysterious, no bodies found, no explanation given. Locals avoided the area, warning that the woods kept what it wanted. Even now, months later, we are haunted by that weekend. Shadows in dark corners, whispers in the night, the sensation of being watched, even in the city. Every time I hear a knock on a door or a window, my heart races. None of us have returned to the cabin, and none of us will. The memory lingers too vividly, too personally, as if the forest reached out and touched something inside us. The truth we learned is brutal. Some places are not for visitors. The forest remembers every footstep, every sound, every intrusion. It watches, it waits, and once it has marked you, it does not forget. Story the end.